Hey there, Patrick Brewer here, Zero Emission Vehicle Fleets Advisor for the Clean BC Go Electric Fleets program. It's not every day that I learn something new, unfortunately, but in today's presentation, I am going to guarantee you that you are going to learn something new. Here's Josipa from QTEC.
Hello, everyone. I'm Josipa Petrunic. I'm President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. And I'm really delighted to be here speaking with you today about how to plan for electrification going forward. In particular, if you're a fleet manager or you're a fleet operator. It's a bold new era for electrification, and certainly in Canada, given that the federal government has announced a lot of money in this space for zero emissions buses, zero emissions school buses, and including zero emission shuttles, such as autonomous and connected vehicles. It's a really new dynamic time for fleet managers and fleet operators to start thinking about battery electrification or hydrogen fuel cell electrification, both of which constitute really great zero emissions technology that create operational savings for your fleets. But this technology is really complicated. So I'm going to take you through a little bit about what the technology is in the marketplace today and some of the core things you're going to want to think about if you're in a role where you're trying to plan the move to zero emissions, but you're just facing a lot of complexity, high cost, technological difficulty, and uncertain potential, even labor conditions that may impinge or hurt your ability to move forward to a zero emissions future. So first, just a little bit about QTRIC. QTRIC, it has a long name, the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium. We've been around for over half a decade. And basically what we are is a technology innovation consortium that tries to get technology projects out the door in Canada with fleet operators, usually transit agencies, in the interest of society, in order to get low carbon smart mobility technologies on Canadian roads in a way that also creates Canadian jobs. So that means we integrate manufacturers and integrators and suppliers and utilities that provide the electricity or local hydrogen producers. And it tries to be, or certainly we try to be as a consortium, a first mover, the kind of organization that gets out there and convinces a lot of people to do things that are high risk and highly complex, but at the end of the day, great for the green economy and great for zero emissions technology and the climate. So first, in terms of the landscape that we're all operating in, within British Columbia, we have a unique and special landscape in particular. In BC, there has been in operation for the last little while the Clean BC program. And to set that in context, if you are operating within that landscape, well then provincially, you're in a context that's very, very conducive to electrification right now. Now, there are some unique considerations to take into account if you are the operator or the fleet manager of a unique heavy-duty fleet, like garbage vehicles or specialized delivery vehicles. But in general, the Clean BC program that the provincial government has been deploying for the last several years is a multi-million-dollar program that is really focused on incentivizing the purchase of electrified vehicles by de-risking their cost and subsidizing their cost up front. It also focuses on bringing in utilities that are meant to create programs that help fleets go electric. And it also has funding and programming that supports the education and the development of the next generation of electricians and mechanics, whom a lot of you are going to have to hire to operate and maintain electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. So the Clean BC program has really kickstarted national efforts to move electrification into the deployment zone. Importantly, in British Columbia, since there isn't really a heavy manufacturing footprint around vehicles, the BC government has really kind of driven a stake in the sand and said, you know, we're going to use this Clean BC program to try to attract foreign direct investment and to try to generate jobs in the components design or manufacturing of the powertrain parts. And it has had success. I mean, there are large players like Ballard, among others, that are operating in British Columbia that do provide and manufacture fundamental components of zero emissions vehicles. So it's an all of government approach to incentivizing the deployment of electric vehicles, supporting the subsidization of those electric vehicles, making sure that there's the right kind of people trained to help fleets operate and maintain those vehicles, and then trying to attract foreign direct investment into the provincial landscape. That's a great start. Now, federally, that can all be mapped onto the recent announcements by the federal government, in particular recent announcements by Minister Catherine McKenna. Mr. McKenna and the federal government right now have really made it clear that investment into green infrastructure is going to be a core component of this government going forward. Now, whether there's a spring election or not, or a fall election or not, we'll leave that to the pundits to declare, but there is no doubt that if there is a continuation of this kind of federal government, that we're going to see billions of dollars going into zero emissions technologies. And that includes specifically zero emissions bus technologies, so battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell buses. But the programming that the federal government has already launched over the last couple of years, and the programming that it's now announced with some of its newest investments in green infrastructure, along with the financing that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is offering to fleets and fleet operators for the move towards zero emissions technologies, all of that combined essentially mean that operators of unique specialized heavy-duty vehicles, non-transit heavy-duty vehicles, are going to find that there's a lot more program support, incentivization support, and research and development support to get these systems out the door and to help you overcome the complexities of these systems. So overall, in Canada, it's generally a good time to be a fleet operator thinking about going electric. But money alone is not enough. And we know that at QTRIC, because put all the money in the world on the table in front of transit agencies or coach bus operators or garbage truck fleet operators or municipal operators, and you will know that you cannot immediately absorb that money because you don't actually necessarily know what you need to buy. And that is a challenge. The landscape is complicated. It's full of a lot of new offerings. It's not clear to a lot of fleet operators how far will these buses go, how much hydrogen is required, what's the maintenance and operation of the battery degradation, how will the fuel cell stack degrade? So a lot of technical questions have to be resolved in order to get from point A to point B, where point B is a fully zero emissions fleet. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the technology that's out there, right now in the bus domain, we do make a lot of buses in Canada, and we do actually lead in the design and deployment of electric buses. So we have Nova Bus in Quebec, and we have New Flyer in Manitoba. We also have other players like Lion Electric that make school buses and now delivery fleet vehicles out of Quebec. So a lot of players in this domain. But outside of Canada, in California, very nearby to British Columbia, there's a lot of innovation happening from companies like Proterra that make a whole range of electrified vehicles, including delivery vehicles. And of course, there's the smaller players coming up in the shuttle domain. So these are the small electric shuttles that can be used to move people, like in Los Angeles, where you have an autonomous connected shuttle that is driverless, moving people from point A to point B as a minibus would. Or you can deploy these shuttles to move packages and small freight in an urban environment where they have access to semi-dedicated or dedicated laneway. So a lot of product offerings in the marketplace today. And if you take a look across Canada, we've had some really big wins recently. TransLink launching electric buses that are interoperable and charged with high power in Vancouver. Edmonton launching buses in one of the coldest climates in the country that have been able to show real smart charging controls at the depot to help minimize the cost of electricity. And of course, in BC, about 11 years ago, there was the Whistler trial with hydrogen fuel cell buses demonstrating substantial success in navigating the mountains of the Rockies. So a lot of opportunity. Now, you might think, well, I don't operate a transit agency, and so transit buses are not that useful to me. In reality, the electrification infrastructure that transit buses need are the same infrastructure that trucks and delivery vehicles need. So the move to transit electrification will necessarily help the trucking and delivery fleet industry. And the reason for that is buses require a lot of power in a very short period of time. And so they cannot operate as electric buses with low power charging only, not in the majority of Canadian cities, not in the majority of North American cities. And so that has led to the development of standardized high power charging systems. These are systems that are deployed en route. They're installed downtown, they're installed on sidewalks, they're installed at rail stops, and they have overhead pantograph systems from the rail industry dropping down to connect to the top of the vehicle to deliver 450 kilowatts, 600 kilowatts. Some folks are hypothesizing up to 1 megawatt of power. That is a lot of energy in a short period of time, but that is the kind of energy that the bus, coach, and trucking industry need. And because transit got out in front, driven by municipal climate goals, it has led to the technological deployment and innovation worldwide of standardized high power charging systems. There are a lot of opportunities for fleet operators to be able to work with local transit systems to use the same charging systems, because delivery vehicles, trucks, they're all going to need access to those high-powered chargers that may well be deployed in your community in the first instance to support public transit. So that's a thought to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is on the hydrogen side. Heavy-duty vehicles fuel up at a different pressure level compared to light-duty vehicles. So if you have a hydrogen car, you're going to be fueling at a certain bar pressure. But if you have a hydrogen bus or a truck or a delivery vehicle, you're fueling up at a different pressure level. So you can't use the hydrogen fueling stations that may have been deployed for hydrogen cars in order to support your delivery vehicles or your truck vehicles or your transit or coach vehicles. And so in the transit domain, again, getting out in front with hydrogen fuel cell buses means that there's a fueling system that's being developed to support transit that will necessarily support trucking and delivery vehicles. Being able to access common hub and spoke or common fueling systems for hydrogen is going to be critical to the deployment of hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the delivery and trucking domain. Now, on the autonomous side of the equation, autonomous and connected vehicle technologies are overlaying with those small shuttles. They're also overlaying with electric buses. And as many of you know, if you've seen any of the commercials from Tesla, you'll know that they're certainly overlaying with trucks and delivery vehicles to achieve platooning. That technology is worthy of its own exegeses and dialogue, but it's interesting to know that when you do associate driverless, autonomous, or semi-autonomous technology on delivery vehicles or on trucks, you do increase the range of battery electric and hydrogen vehicles, and that is largely because they start moving in optimized form, at optimized speeds, at optimized intervals. And so that driverless technology is going to become more and more important, not necessarily to replace your driver, but to assist your driver in making sure that the electrified or hydrogen electrified powertrain is operating at its most optimal level. And the reason that that's important, it's not just a physics wonky kind of thing to be interested in. It's really important because unfortunately no longer do we have access to the luxury of wasting energy. There was a time up until today where, in fact, we could in fact waste diesel or gasoline. Now, if you're a for-profit fleet manager or for-profit fleet owner, you know that fuel is a big cost to you, and reducing fuel is really important to you from a profit perspective. But the reality is that diesel and gasoline are very energy intense. And so some wastage can occur that can be absorbed largely because historically prices were relatively low. And even when prices were high for diesel or gasoline, they were nowhere near as expensive as they would have to be in order for fleet operators to really get down to the microcosmic molecular level of waste savings. In the electrified world and the hydrogen fuel cell world, the difference is you don't have any space for error. There's almost no give in the powertrains in that you have very little buffer room. The batteries are not dense enough. Even the hydrogen in a fuel tank is not dense enough to compete with the energy density of a carbon molecule. And so every electron counts. Every hydrogen molecule counts. Every meter that your vehicle moves counts as degrading of the battery capacity or consuming range on the hydrogen vehicle. And so it becomes critically important to really precisely know how this technology will work in your fleet community, and then to potentially consider in the future automating some aspects of it in order to optimize the deployment of the vehicle, minimize the wastage of the electrons or the hydrogen. And so if you take a look at examples across North America, there's lots of initial prototypes and demonstration projects going out the door to really demonstrate how efficient can we get electric buses, how efficient can we get hydrogen fuel cell shuttles, how efficiently can we get autonomous electric shuttles operating, because everybody knows there are no electrons or hydrogen molecules to waste in the real world when you go to a zero emissions fleet. Now, on the trucking side, there have been some initial deployments as well. And so if you take a look at the trucking landscape, there's everything from the Tesla Cybertruck through to postal services using new cutaway vehicles and special delivery vehicles with electrified powertrains, over to major players like Daimler and Volvo that may have been a little bit slower to the game, but now are certainly looking to lead the hydrogen and battery electric heavy-duty trucking industry. So a lot more products to choose from in a very short period of time means it can be very confusing. So that leads to the ultimate question: how do we plan for electrification? Well, there's some simple steps to take. one of the things that we really focus on at QTEC is making sure that our transit agencies or our municipal fleet operators are really aware of the need to, first off, plan. But in this world, because you don't have electrons to waste or hydrogen molecules to waste, that planning means physics and mathematical planning. Physics, mathematics, and economics, all of our favorite subjects put into one. Step number one is most especially, you need to be able to launch a feasibility study. And within that feasibility study, you need to be able to look at all the vehicles in your fleet, the routes they take, the topography they operate on, how many passengers or drivers or load are those vehicles carrying, what kind of stops and starts they have. And you need to be able to mathematically model that to be able to prove to yourself how far can the technologies available today actually get your fleet, how many electrons are needed, how many charge periods are needed, how many hydrogen fueling episodes are needed. And that is probably going to change your assumption about what the art of the possible is. I can tell you at QTEC, almost all of the transit agencies we started working with 4 or 5 years ago really truly believe that technology was innovating so fast that it would be a one-to-one diesel bus replacement soon. That is not true. It's not true today. It wasn't true 5 years ago. It will not be true 5 years from now. It is an entire energy system overhaul, and every single transit agency that we have done feasibility modeling work with has changed their electrification plan because the laws of physics don't lie and gravity doesn't go upwards. So the result of that physics is that these vehicles will only deliver a certain amount of range under your operational conditions. You need to know exactly what that is so you can determine how many vehicles, how many chargers, how much hydrogen fueling, and how many operational stops are required for your service to deliver the service it delivers today. With all of that physics and mathematical modeling, you can then tabulate very precisely what the cost is. So your first 4 steps are planning. Establish the starting point with the feasibility study. Determine which technological options out there, the trucks, the shuttles, the buses, the coaches, with which size of battery, which size of hydrogen tank. There's not that many out there, so it's a finite set. You got to pick from those technologies and map them onto what the physics of your own route operation looks like. Then you can tabulate what the actual electricity or hydrogen bill will be and how much money you're going to save over your current diesel or gasoline or natural gas expenditures. And that leads you to what we all want, which is the business case, the ROI. What is the benefit of investing in this stuff, which is usually a lot more expensive on day one? You know, an electric bus is twice the price of a diesel bus. A fuel cell bus is 3 times the price of an electric bus, or a diesel bus rather, and then add in all the charging and hydrogen infrastructure. It's very expensive on day one. So you need to be able to do the planning, and the cost analysis to be able to tell yourself how many years before I pay this all off. And after that ROI is clear, how many years of savings over diesel or savings over gasoline am I going to profit from? And of course, most fleets do want to know that there is a profit margin at the end of the day, that you're not just breaking even and going green, but that you're actually going to be saving money. And so that kind of planning is critical. And I can tell you in some of the agencies we are doing work with, from TransLink to Orange County to Big Blue Bus to Riverside to Elk Grove, some of the communities in British Columbia and in California, that planning, that mathematics, that physics and economics have led to fundamental changes in terms of how these agencies are pursuing now electrification and what they're actually planning to buy and deploy. The next steps that you need to take, think about once you've got the technology and the physics and the math lining up, and you know what technology can actually serve the service that you need to deliver and generate a profit margin for you or cost savings over diesel and gasoline, then you need to think about the operational challenges. Even if you get all the tech right, I can tell you there is not one agency in Canada that has started doing electric busing or thinking about hydrogen fuel cell busing without really considering the overhaul in their labor force. And it's not as simple as, okay, we're going to need a few electricians to manage what mechanics took care of before. It's the planning process, the commissioning process, and then fixing everything that will go wrong, because lots of stuff will go wrong in the first few years. It is still relatively new technology. And when deployed on scale, all of the systems problems that you can imagine arise will in fact arise. And so the next step you have to do is that operational planning piece. And that includes thinking about where your charge is going to be, where's your fueling going to be located, what is the site where it will actually be located, and whether you actually own that property or you're going to share it with another fleet somewhere nearby. And then what people on your team are going to take care of all that stuff. because there actually aren't that many companies out there that take care of that stuff for you. The industry is not mature enough that you can just pay a company a service fee and they will take care of all the chargers and energy storage and hydrogen for you. That industry is just starting to develop. So you really got to think about who you're going to pay to take care of this stuff. And if these are people inside your team, you're going to need a whole new skill set in a short period of time. Now, I can tell you on the planning side, most of our transit agencies plan to have 1 or 2 people at the planning table in going electric. Most of them grew that team to a dozen, and in one case, over 30 people, in order to manage a deployment of a handful of electric buses that they thought would only take 1 or 2 people to plan out. That's how complicated it is. And I'm not trying to scare you away. What I'm trying to say is you got to do that planning and then think immediately about the operational transition. It won't be easy, but it will be beneficial over time. The last steps you need to take then is really the on-site requirement consideration. Do you have enough transmission power coming to your facility or your depot? Do you have a close enough hydrogen fueling solution and a distribution provider who's going to help you with a reasonable fee for service deliver hydrogen to your fleet? The next thing you're going to want to do is take a look at your procurement processes. Generally, in your procurement process, you're going to have some kinds of quid pro quo, where the manufacturers or the suppliers of the products are going to be responsible to you for certain things should matters go wrong. Well, in the complex world of zero emissions transit or zero emissions coach or truck or delivery vehicles, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of things can go wrong. And there isn't an established pathway necessarily for resolving those problems. So what you're going to want to do in your procurement contracts and in your procurement process is really think about making sure that the supplier or the vendor of the vehicles and the integration services can provide you with all the technology you need in the time you need it for the cost you need, but also all of the hand-holding when and if things go wrong, because they will go wrong. And we have learned in the transit world that there are complexities. You may buy standardized chargers, but there isn't 10 years of experience in manufacturing this stuff and deploying it. So you may get chargers that on paper are standardized, but actually in operation still have some glitches when they connect to the vehicle. That's all cost to you. And so in your procurement process, you're going to want to make sure that you're baking in more responsibilities for the manufacturers who stand right now to make a lot of money off a lot of subsidized technology. And it's in their interest to handhold you to make sure that your fleet operates well in any case, certainly in these early days. You then want to take a look at the dual integration of ZEBs with your pre-existing fleet. So keep in mind, most agencies, most fleets are not going to go to 100% zero emissions technologies tomorrow. You're going to choose maybe 5% or 10% or a certain number of vehicles to start with. Well, what that means is you have to maintain your diesel vehicles and your gasoline vehicles at the same time as launching these really complicated battery electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. How are you going to do that? And that has to be planned ahead of time because it's not simple. The same people can't manage both unless there's a lot of training that happens. And on one side of the equation, it's all new technology, as is the energy system that supplies the fuel. So you can expect things will go wrong over here with this little fleet that you've launched, or this portion of the fleet that you've launched with this new tech, while you have to maintain and deliver your current diesel or gasoline or natural gas vehicles. And I can tell you during the pandemic period, although it's hurt transit, there's a number of transit agencies that have said to us, look, the drop in ridership has actually made it easier for us to move to electrification because it was so difficult to manage our current diesel fleet plus the new electric vehicles at the same time. But with ridership drop off, we've kind of been given a bit of breathing room to focus on this complex stuff over here while not having to deliver as many vehicle services on our pre-existing diesel fleet. So if you don't have the benefit of a pandemic in the future, and I mean that, in the manner of you may not have the benefit of a massive drop off in the need for your services to give you breathing room, you're probably going to be in the zone of having to manage 2 fleets at once, and that's complicated. The last steps you want to take is make sure that you have loggers on everything. You have data loggers, telemetry devices that are on the powertrains, on the vehicles, on the chargers, on the fueling systems, because you were promised certain kind of technology by manufacturers and by advocates like myself. You're promised the offering of a green future that's going to give you operational savings. And if you're a for-profit fleet, profit margins over and above your diesel, gasoline, or natural gas operations. So if that's the case and you're trying to get to that future of profitability or operational savings, you're going to need loggers on your vehicles, on your chargers, on your hydrogen fueling to prove out that they actually are performing at that level of efficiency, that you are getting the kilowatt hours per kilometer or the kilograms per 100 kilometer or the energy efficiency out of your chargers that you were promised. And if you're not, well, then of course, either in your contracts, you have punitive measures at place, or you have deep lessons learned about what you buy and what technology you integrate for the next round of electrification or decarbonization of your fleet. And lastly, establish that final point, that's the commissioning, the full in-service with the hand-holding by your suppliers and vendors. But that final point is going to have to be the point where you declare that you have learned everything there is to learn, at least in a finite period of time, in deploying your zero emissions vehicles, and you're ready to move to the next round of scaling up. That's going to be a critical point, because if you think that this is going to be a 12-month transition or an 18-month transition, and you come to realize that it's actually a 24 to 36-month transition, that fundamentally changes the timeline of your fleet getting to zero emissions. And in some cases, if you're a municipal fleet, that will fundamentally change the timeline of a municipal commitment or a regional commitment to climate action by a certain date. Really critical to keep that timeline, that endpoint in mind, and see what actually that transition period looks like. So some lessons for fleets from the transit world. We've been spending about 6 years now at QTRIC helping agencies deploy this technology and especially predict and plan for it. And now we're in the business of analyzing the logger data to see how this stuff performs against promises and predictions made a few years ago. And we've learned a lot. There's some things that I really like to share with fleet managers and operators here. So the first thing is, this is a whole energy system overhaul. It's not a heart transplant. You're not taking out like a diesel powertrain, replacing it with an electric powertrain, but everything else stays the same. Not at all true. Everything is about to change, everything. From where you fuel, how you fuel, your station stops, the amount of downtime, even your labor relations will need to be reassessed, because nothing about this technology is the same as what your pre-existing technology is. And 4 or 5 years ago, we had constant experience of transit agencies saying to us, look, the technology is going to improve, the batteries will improve, it'll be a one-to-one diesel bus replacement. That has never happened, and it's not going to happen. And unless you're a very small fleet with very, very small routes, it's not actually going to be the pathway forward. What you're going to have to face is a future of a total energy transformation and overhaul. So that's the first thing, and that's why that feasibility planning, that mathematics and physics and economics is so critical. It's a total energy system overhaul and nothing less. Next, you have to communicate with your utility early on. There are no utilities in Canada today that have a heavy duty or transit electrification strategy. There are some utilities that have started with strategies for light duty car electrification, and they have some incentive programs and ideas around that, and they have some helpful support. None of them have a strategy for heavy duty electrification. Bus, coach, trucks, delivery vehicles. That's only starting now, and we've been motivating our utilities to get on board with getting a heavy-duty fleet electrification program out the door, because the load is massive. Fleets don't buy one vehicle, they tend to buy in bulk. And so the load on the grid and the demands and the requirements of the utility are changed overnight. And it's a stepwise function, not a logarithmic gradual curve of evolution. So utilities are a little bit behind on helping you to get ready. However, if you're in BC, you're lucky, because BC Hydro is a little bit ahead of everybody else. They have gotten involved in helping TransLink deploy their electric buses. So BC Hydro has learned a lot about heavy duty electrification in a very short period of time, and they stand ready with the Clean BC program to really help you out. Next, you need to look beyond the initial deployment. So it is true that you're not going to electrify your entire fleet on day one. You're going to start with a portion of your fleet, but you need to plan from day one of the fueling or charging scale up. To go from 2 or 3 electric shuttles, for example, or these 2 or 3 delivery vehicles in your depot, that may be manageable with your current transformer, without an energy storage device, with your current staffing. But once you scale up to full fleet electrification, everything from demand charges to energy storage to transmission upgrades and transformer upgrades, all of that has to take effect. And it takes effect pretty quickly, even if your fleet is only 20 vehicles of a delivery van size. Depending on when they're charging in cluster, you may actually need a whole energy overhaul on day one just for those first few vehicles. If you're planning to scale up, successfully. Next, you need to secure buy-in from all of your staff. This is complicated stuff. And so if you have one champion or a mayor who's a champion or your CEOs who's a champion, that's great. But this is an entire buy-in of an overhaul. And what we've seen over the years is a lot of resistance at the mid and lower levels, or resistance from operational staff who are told to make this work and not brought into the process on day one. So whatever your ROI is for your fleet at a high level, you need to bring staff in to make sure that it is also an ROI for them, that this technology is presented as stuff that's going to make their life easier, their working environment healthier, the environment better overall, that it gives them buy-in and that they have buy-in early on to pose their questions and concerns as part of your planning process. Otherwise, you'll face resistance, guaranteed, 100%. And this technology is complicated enough that you don't also need staffing and labor resistance. Energy management is critical. And so one of the things we've learned as a step for you to consider out of the lessons learned from transit is, again, when you start adding buses all at the same time, especially battery electric ones, you start ramping up the demand charges, you start requiring a lot of power in a short period of time that you may not have properly planned for. So energy management's pretty critical. It's not just about getting you enough power to fundamentally charge your fleet. It's about getting power to your facility that can be modified, right? Power that goes into a storage device and then is delivered depending on the needs of the fleet. Smart charging controls, all of those things that are really the landscape of utilities historically are now going to be the landscape of an efficient operations for any fleet. And lastly, you want to look at potentially additional staff. So there's a certain amount of buy-in you can get. There's a certain amount of training of your current staff that you can survive with, but there are also some fundamentally new skill sets you're going to need. You're going to need those electricians for high power equipment. You're absolutely going to need a data analyst or a set of data analysts, or outsource to some data analysts who are looking at the performance of your vehicles and letting you know whether the vehicles, the chargers, and the hydrogen fueling are operating the way you were promised. Some last considerations if you're operating specialized vehicles like garbage and refuse vehicles or service vehicles. These are heavy-duty, unique vehicles, and so you're going to want to consider the fueling and charging clusters that already exist or are likely to be deployed by public sector partners nearby. So if you're thinking about a high-power charger, right, generally it's one charger per 8 to 10 vehicles, max, depending on their route, depending on their profile. You can only get that many through one charger. Well, one charger is $1 million to $1.5 million, depending on the power level. You may not have the money to go buy all the infrastructure for your own fleet. You might have a much smaller fleet. You might be in a zone in post-pandemic where you have to cut costs, not grow costs. So you're going to want to look to TransLink and other agencies that have already invested in high-power charging systems. You may be able to tap into those pieces of equipment because the transit agencies today are not using those pieces of equipment 100% of the time. Now, in the early stage, there may be no scope for sharing, but in a later stage of electrification for transit or public coach fleets, that infrastructure won't be used 24 hours a day, even though it should be used 24 hours a day to optimize its cost, right? And to lead to its depreciation faster. So you may be able to tap into unused hours of charging infrastructure, or you may be able to tap into a hydrogen fueling system that was set up for transit or coaches nearby that you can tap into to serve your fleet in the near-term future. You're going to want to therefore engage with the early movers in your community, whether they're transit and public sector and you're for-profit and private, doesn't matter because the fleet learnings are going to be fairly similar across your fleets in terms of the operational challenges and the success stories of how to work around those challenges. And lastly, you're going to want to look at potential future new revenue models. Talk to your utility about vehicle-to-grid opportunities. It doesn't exist a lot in Canada today, really only pilot projects, but it's the idea that if you can handle it and if your vehicles are designed properly, you should be able to feed power back into the grid for some kind of design incentive. So you might be able to treat your vehicles as a source of redundant energy that the utility can use and that the utility would be willing to pay you for. And that's another revenue line item that you may want to consider to offset your costs. So it's not simple. It is complicated, comes with a lot of problems, but at the end of the day, it will save you money, it is better for the environment, and it creates jobs in the local economy. So I wish everybody best of luck in moving forward to their electrification plans. If you walk in with eyes wide open that it's complex and difficult and things will go wrong, but you can plan your way out of most of those problems in the early days and then talk your way through partnerships with agencies that have already gone first, you're going to be much more prepared to get to a return on investment sooner rather than later. Thank you very much.
Well, I promised you'd learn something, and I'm pretty sure you did. If you didn't, sorry I disappointed you. But I think there's a takeaway for everyone in the audience from this presentation. And if anyone now wants to suggest future topics, you know where to reach me at fleets@pluginbc.ca. And if you're interested in the Clean BC Go Electric Fleets program, let me know. You know how to contact me. Look forward to hearing from you. Cheers and have a great day.